Good morning, everyone. We have our POR working subgroup meeting on crimes today, Wednesday, December 8th, from 10 until 11 a.m. Welcome, everyone.
You want me to get things rolling, Mark?
Yeah.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. So at the last co-chairs meeting, we talked about the issues that each of these individual subgroups would address at this hopefully final subgroup meeting before we move forward with selecting the issues that are going to be included. And I know a lot of these issues have kind of bled over from one subgroup to the other. So if something isn't mentioned in this, please feel free to bring it up, but it's probably going to be brought up in another subgroup. The focus of today's subgroup meeting on crimes is intended to be the issue that's been talked about regarding same set of circumstances attachment for false imprisonment. So I believe the last time we spoke, we had kind of come to an agreement around this concept of removing the same set of circumstances attachment to false imprisonment at the charging level and including it at the conviction level. So that hopefully is going to pull away some of these folks that maybe are involved in domestic situations or other situations that have a very loose or no nexus to criminal sexual conduct or predatory offenses. So with that, I'm wondering if there are any thoughts on that idea or how we might phrase that question for the whole group.
And I think the language basically says limit false imprisonment registration requirement to convictions only, removing same set of circumstances from the requirement for that crime and that crime alone. Any comment on that?
Stunned silence is consent, right?
Which doesn't mean everybody's in support of it. It simply means it's a legitimate question to poll on.
Mark, can you display the language that you're looking at? Folks often have an easier time kind of weeding through potentially some of the issues if they have it in front of them.
So are you saying the statutory language that was drafted?
Yes.
Or let's see. What I'm doing is okay. It looks like this is essentially the language. Again, probably the important thing is not to go into detail about the exact language right now. But after, it's more the concept of what is being considered in the poll, and that essentially is removing same set of circumstances. This is not the time to get into dotting the i's and crossing the t's. We'll be doing that looking at the reports. Angie.
In that regard, I think, and I don't know if I sent this to you because I can't keep track, but I think that because we're changing it, or we're recommending, if we recommend a change here, I should say, it has to follow with the federal and the out of state. So I did draft some language that would do it in each spot, and I just can't remember if that's something I shared with you, but just to bring that up, that if we change it here, we're going to need to work the language in those other areas. So.
Yeah, and that would be provided to the working group members to review the exact language. The idea here is it the proper polling question? Okay, Karen.
Sorry, I know you said we aren't going to wordsmith here, but this still is just a charge, right? Am I reading this right? They could be acquitted.
Yeah. So under current law, you are charged with failure to register. And if you're convicted of something out of the same set of circumstances, you would have to register. The change contemplated is that you have to actually be convicted of false imprisonment.
That's not what this says. This says you were charged with our petition for.
Yeah. And I think Angie said that she has more updated information on it. That's why I'm saying don't get into the wordsmithing on the actual language today. It's more the concept. Either you're in support of this idea of a change or you're not. Representative Moeller.
Yeah, that is exactly what I was going to say too. I know we're not getting into wordsmithing, but like the concept as it's described here is not the same concept that we discussed of having just a conviction so I just have this, my hand was raised before she started talking, but I was just going to highlight that too.
Yeah, that's why I was hesitant to bring up, we had many different versions there, and I was hesitant to bring up that language because I knew then we'd start jumping into discussion of the wording on it. It's, if you can focus on more that concept and what will be presented to you is what I hope Angie would have detailed language on that then. So Angie.
Yeah, the language that Sheriff Heck, I think, worked on right initially did separate out false imprisonment. It wasn't the language that you guys just saw is not the language the full language that he had. So that it required a conviction for false imprisonment.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure what happened with, I mean, this looked like it was just a little part of that. So, but like I said, then I was kind of messing around with the out of state and federal offenses based on that. But yeah, it would definitely require a conviction.
Yeah. Sheriff Heck.
And yeah, to pile on this issue, I believe that is the language that we drafted for a different proposal on how to handle this. So yeah, the language for the concept we're proposing now is not the language that was displayed there, I believe.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yep. But Angie, you would provide that. We can get together afterwards and get that exact language. But the important thing
yeah, I
here
think-
is there any question about what the intention of the change or the proposal would be? Representative O'Neill.
Thanks. So I actually wanted to talk about the content of it. I know we've been talking about this again for a couple months, and I'm just wondering if Brian could, again, I apologize, Brian, I keep going to you, but you seem to have all the research in your head and you deal with offenders at the therapeutic level, which is incredibly helpful. But if he could explain what the nexus is or not nexus of a domestic violence situation and a predatory offender situation. Because that's what we're trying to parse out, right? We're trying to parse out the domestic violence versus the predatory offender.
You know, I don't know how in depth I can get in terms of that. I know we could get into, you know, people have commented, I think Nicole and some other folks, about sexual violence going underreported in domestic assault situations where they're not charged with sex offenses that have happened, or people are being sexually assaulted in relationships all the time. But I think my main thing with the false imprisonment piece is going to be again, going back to the main purpose behind the registry, and somebody that is, you know, the law enforcement is looking for an unknown perpetrator. And so the focus on the people that have been convicted of false imprisonment or charged with false imprisonment, and it's domestic assault related, it's going to be a known perpetrator. So being on the registry for those reasons is not going to be helpful if we're looking for an unknown perpetrator, somebody that's committed a rape of a stranger in a public place, that kind of situation. So that's my main piece in terms of the false imprisonment or non-sex related offenses being pulled from the registry, is that those are focusing on known perpetrators and alleged perpetrators already. So somebody else can jump in though, if you know, in terms of the question Representative O'Neill had. Feel free, for sure.
I'd like to hear from Josh from the BCA, because he also works in the database on a regular basis. And does he see this nexus, and is it, what are his thoughts about making this change?
I guess I would kind of reiterate that part of it, probably a lot of it, is underreported or non-reported sexual violence and domestics. I do see that when we deal with folks on the registry who are married or have or in a committed relationship in their home, we're not getting a lot from the victim or the other spouse or partner in there. So just from anecdotal, I would guess that there is a lot of unreported stuff that's not on there. That if that is part of the same set of circumstances, it probably doesn't hurt to keep it on there. That's just my opinion, though.
Thanks, Josh. I think it's really important for us to hear from people that use the database on a regular basis, like Josh, to solve crimes. And so I think we need to listen and maybe even amplify his concerns, because he is one of in this group that work in the database every single day to find suspects and get justice for victims. So his words are important to me. Thank you.
Jim.
So seriously, we are just going to make an assumption in a domestic case that that person is a sex offender? Is that where
I
we're
don't
at?
think anybody said that.
Well, that's what I'm hearing.
I thought we were talking about false imprisonment is what we're talking about.
Well, I've been in situations where I've represented clients who have been charged with domestics. And then when negotiations aren't going so well, prosecutor then files a false imprisonment charge just to up stakes and to sort of cool down the registration. I mean, this is America.
Representative Moeller.
I just wanted to circle back to something we talked about earlier with regard to false imprisonment. And that's also that people can get charged with that in like drug cases too. So it's not just
Yes.
domestics, but there are other cases. And so I think what's happening is because of that same set of circumstances and that false imprisonment charge, we are capturing more people on the registry than what was intended to have them on the registry. So I just wanted to point out that it's not just domestic cases. We have talked about some drug cases too, where those charges have been filed.
Brian.
So just reiterating my point before and adding to what Kelly just mentioned in terms of drug cases, whether it's domestic related, drug related, false imprisonment, situations that are known perpetrators. If we can remove those folks off of the registry, it's a fine-tuned, smaller subset of people that if an offense is committed by a stranger and it's an unknown perpetrator, it's going to be a smaller list of people that maybe are more likely to be those potential suspects in those types of cases. We can remove the incest perpetrator who's been in the community for 20 years with no known sexual reoffense, no known criminal reoffense. We can remove the statutory guys. That's another thing for the method subgroup we'll get into later, but around the false imprisonment or drug related, domestic related folks, again, I think these are all known perpetrators. They're not going to be on that list of how can we find who did this stranger offense in the community. So it's really helping fine tune the registry and limiting it to people that just from a resource standpoint, law enforcement doesn't have to weed through a lot of people that are going to be not helpful.
So Angie, is this the actual language, or did I put up the same one that was causing questions? It looks like this is the language that goes along with this poll question.
Mark, I think that is the proper language.
Yeah. But again, I think this is a little clearer poll question than others. Let's see, Angie.
Sorry, I was muted. I was trying to answer your question with sign language, which I'm not as familiar with as I could be. But yeah, this is the language that was in the actual draft.
And again, when we send out this poll, I think maybe actually sending out the poll will be a little more delayed than sending out the questions and the supporting documents, so people can review that for a few days before they actually vote. And I think what we're looking at is perhaps putting off the actual vote until Monday, maybe going into Tuesday for that, but getting out the questions and supporting documents tomorrow would be sort of the best approach to this. Okay, other questions on that before we move on to the next questions that okay, so the next questions, Sheriff Heck, were on the juvenile registration.
Yes. Do we have a survey question prepared on the juvenile issue for crimes?
Basically here. Those two questions.
Okay. So again, I guess in keeping this theme of, keeping this moving forward, my question would be, do we think that these are the proper topics for the poll issue? And do they properly convey the sentiments that have been discussed here so we can determine what the support is for each of these concepts?
I think these have been two issues that have been discussed and debated quite a bit.
I think the only other issue, which I believe Representative O'Neill indicated that probably wouldn't have a lot of legs, so I don't, and then there were issues on the EJJ and adult prosecution, but I guess another question could be, if we're going into the multiple question theory, limit registration of juveniles to some subgroup of offenses, but that would take still, the legislature, sorting out which offenses they would want registration for. And from an administrative standpoint, I still think it would be a bit of a nightmare to try to deal with the EJJ and adult prosecution with the out-of-state or federal people for sure, maybe even for the in-state folks, but just because of issues of getting records and things like that. But it's possible that some people might be interested in that based on our discussions in those areas. But I'm fine either way. I just thought I would throw that out there.
Representative O'Neill.
Thank you. So I was studying law for something else, and I came across 609.055, which is capability of children to commit crimes, which puts it at 14. So it clearly says children under the age of 14 years of old are not capable of committing crimes. So I'm wondering, I don't know what statute it says that a 10-year-old can be put on the POR, but maybe someone could point to that, because I haven't seen that statute as to how we think it's all the way down to 10. But here in 609.055, it clearly says children under the age of 14 are not capable of committing a crime. So just wondering if someone could clarify that, and how does that look in practice in the courts?
I don't know if there's a statute, but I know that there's case law that has upheld the registration of juveniles as young as, I think, 11.
Actually, Kate Rickman had talked about that and explained that process, where she said it's not in statute that you can adjudicate as young as 10 years old, but it's inferred from the definition of child protective services is under the age of 10, and that anyone 10 and older is subject to adjudication. Anybody under the age of 10 is subject to child protection, so does not fall under the juvenile system. So the registration law says adjudicated delinquent, and that can occur as young as 10. That's why registration applies to anyone 10 and older. Katrina.
Yeah, I was just gonna, good morning, everyone, by the way. I was just gonna point to the statute where delinquency is set, which is exactly to what Mark was speaking to. It does lie within the child welfare statutes. And just so I make sure I'm giving you the right statute, it is Minnesota statute 260C.007 subdivision 6.
Can you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Yep, absolutely. It is 260C.007 subdivision 6, and it says child in need of protection or services, and so that's where it sets. It's speaking to exactly what Mark was just explaining.
Thank you. Well, I think given 609.055 saying a child under the age of 14 is not capable of committing a crime, there's further substantiation to set the number at 14. I mean, we also changed CSC 1 through 4, I guess, saying raising the age of a child to 4 or just under 14.
And Jim.
That would still mean that juveniles would have to register.
And that's why the other poll question is because that has been one of those big debate discussion areas, is all juveniles or what is looked upon as one of those compromised areas, the 14, just removing those under the age of 14. So Representative Moeller.
Thanks. And I guess my question kind of relates to one of the other subcommittees and what we've discussed before about an off-ramp, so that are they discussing at all any kind of different off-ramp for juveniles who made it on the registry, or would there be like one off-ramp that would apply to everybody? Meaning that juveniles could maybe apply earlier or something like that. I just was curious if those discussions, how those have turned out in the other groups.
Did you want to respond, Brian?
Yeah, Stacy just put it in the chat too, off ramp for everyone. So we'd have one panel process. And we'll talk about that from 11 to 12 in the methods subgroup next too. So delve into that a little bit more.
Because I just didn't know if there was some, something sort of different than maybe for juveniles who went on, if they would have maybe an earlier time to apply or anything like that. Oh, Stacy's putting, I'll just read your comments in the chat, Stacy. Thanks.
Okay, Katrina.
I just have a question in regards to how the poll is going to be administered. So are we going to have, is the poll going to be able to give us an understanding of the folks who are in favor of juveniles getting off the registry, and then also be able to delineate out the difference in, if that is not a possibility, then people are still in favor of at least the 14? And does that make sense? So what I'm really trying to, are we going to make the assumption that if people are saying kids off the registry, that they would then in turn be in favor of at least raising the age to 14? Does my question make sense, Mark?
It does, but it does get into that complicated area of that type of interpretation. Now, the poll is not a private poll. Everybody will be polled by name, so it's not something. I suppose if there was confusion that somebody said you make registration requirement only applicable to adults, but you voted no on taking under 14 off, that would be kind of a conflict. So
So I just have one quick suggestion for the survey poll is that folks not be pulled by name, but by agency or entity that they represent. Just because the vast majority of us are here representing not ourselves, but an agency. So it is, I don't want there to be confusion as to the difference between what somebody's personal belief is and what their representation is from the agencies. So that would just be a suggestion for food for thought for the chairs as that begins to get developed.
Stacy.
Yeah, so just to follow up on my comments in the chat to respond to Representative Mueller, we do have the off-ramp for everyone, but the petition option is in current draft form as proposed, is available at 5 years, which doesn't address the more complex issues that in particular Patty has been raising, which is the registration obligations and being on the registry create obstacles for young people from a collateral consequences standpoint, and that it impacts really their kind of launch into the world. So it's not a panacea for the issue of whether kids should be on or not.
Representative O'Neill.
Thank you. And back to Olivia's point from the BCA, just the legislature is incredibly interested in not, as she said, not individual opinions, but that we all represent an entity, an agency, an interest group, and that our names are important only because they're tied to that. And I think it's really important too that maybe there's not a lot of time, but in the time that we have to try to pull our, whoever we are representing, pull them and find out what the collective voice is. That's incredibly important information for the legislature, which is why we, as you know, anyone that's working with the legislature knows, okay, so we've got letters of support or letters of concern from, you name it, XYZ, agency or association or sheriff's association, chief of police association, and so on and so on. So I just wanted to reiterate that, and that's incredibly important information for the legislature. Thanks.
And everybody will be tied to who they represent. I mean, if we have 2 representatives from the BCA and they vote differently, that's probably an issue for the BCA, or same thing for the DOC, that and for victim services, but there's nothing that prevents those individuals from voting on behalf of an organization they represent. But it probably has to come down to that particular working group member making that decision, whether they're representing their organization or their own thoughts. Janine.
Thanks. I was going back to the bigger picture of the poll versus the issue. So your comment, Mark, earlier about we may need to be careful. It's gonna get complicated. So if I said the registration requirement only applies to adults, and I say yes to that, I only want adults on there, do I then not vote for the other one, make registration requirement only applicable to those 14 and older? So like, I don't want it to skew or misrepresent the intention of the voting, because there are different positions on these issues. So I'm sorry I can't come up with language right away to help you tease it out, but it may be like that tiered sort of flow chart. I'm not sure how to do that. I can help offline if you want, but I think it's important to, if we had juveniles on, do you want it to look like this? Do you want juveniles, yes or no? Kind of something that would break it up. I'm just trying to help on the poll language, less than the issue itself discussion.
Yeah. Would it make sense that the question on only applicable to adults says, if you vote no on this, would you support only applicable to those 14 and older? Or if yes, would you support as a compromise those 14 and only those 14 and older?
I would just suggest that we be very clear in separating the issues as yes or no's, because I think there is a lot of room for confusion. And each question should be very clearly independent of each other. Just again, as a suggestion to the chairs as they develop the poll content, because I know that there are going to be some folks who have not regularly been a part of these conversations, and they're going to need a bit more delineation, perhaps.
Sheriff Heck?
I think a simple suggestion as a conditional statement of if registration still applies to juveniles, would you support changing that to 14 or something similar like that? So just a conditional statement of if registration still applied to juveniles, and then go into the question.
Good wordsmithing. Jim?
It's the statute that Representative O'Neill referred to about 14-year-olds being charged with a crime. That's sort of the lowest that we go for certifying juveniles as adults. So by a statutory construct, once a juvenile is certified, they are now an adult, and then would be subject to, I would suppose, since they've been convicted of a crime, subject to the same registry requirements. But I'm talking about those who are not certified, who are still in the juvenile system, who would find themselves facing registration. And you need to understand there's another classification of juveniles that we're not seeing, who are still found delinquent, not convicted of a crime, but still have to register. So if you put that only adults would register, those kids that are certified would be subject to the registration requirements, but there wouldn't be just this threshold. Then those that get found delinquent, who are 15, 16, 17, would have to, or could be made to register. So you need to understand those distinctions.
Patty?
I just get frustrated with 14 being an option. When you look at the intent of what registration was for, it was to find out who these people are who commit these unknown crimes. We've had the research and the presentation saying that juveniles mostly victimize someone they know. A 14-year-old can't drive, so keeping an address and a registration of where this person is and is kind of ludicrous. They're at their home typically, or they're not. 14 to me still makes no sense as a viable option. I have to refer to Michigan, where the shooter was 15 and they held the parents somewhat accountable. To me, this is a social service or a family issue, but the criminal justice system is not the answer for juveniles. And I just don't want 14 to look like the great compromise, because to me, it's not. And I just wanted to throw that out there, because 14, when I look at the intent of the law and what law enforcement would use it for, it doesn't fit, and it does cause great harm to children. So I just had to voice my once again opinion before this becomes like the viable compromise option, because it doesn't do anything for everything that I've read and researched about for a lot of years. Thank you.
It looks like, I think some of that clarification that Jim made about if they're certified as an adult, they would be required to register at a younger age. And that quote, compromise, is taken into account at age 14, since they can be certified. So, Stacy.
I just want to address Patty's comment. What I hear you saying, Patty, and I think you've been pretty clear, but what I hear you saying is in your view, based on how you thought about the registry back in 1990, that what the registry has evolved into, like it's almost higher cutoff for sorry, I'm distracted by the recording message. Would a higher age bring you any, would you have a different view if it were like 16? I mean, does that still not address your overall concern about kids, brain development, et cetera?
You know, this is the big question. I guess it would, I think that it would just be the really rare exception that a juvenile should ever be on a registry, because of it, and it would depend on the crime. If this child was going out and assaulting unknown individuals and or had hundreds of victims, or had, you know, extreme circumstances, putting them on a registry is not going to reduce the risk to the public at that point. There needs to be other measures that would get this kid help and get him off the streets. So the registry, it's like people, I think, have a higher expectation of what it's going to do than what it is actually designed to do. It's like the BCA says, you know, it's our job to just know where these people are. And, you know, juveniles, for the most part, they're at home, or they're homeless, or, you know, they're couch hopping, but the research shows that the highest percentage victimize someone known to them, if somebody was accessible to them. They're not a predator. They're not likely to be that dangerous rapist in the woods who jumps out and snags. And so I don't see a purpose in putting juveniles on, except for, like I said, if they became that person, there could be an unusual exception. But 16-year-olds do really stupid things, and some of them involve sex, but registering them has shown more harm than good. It counters what would help this child change their behavior. It doesn't get us to the promised land of no more victims. And so, but it does cause great harm, and it actually may reduce the likelihood of that child getting the help that's needed. So to me, it makes no sense. It's not that I'm unwilling to compromise. I work with law enforcement all these years, and I get their purpose for wanting to know, but it's such a small percentage of, I mean, I don't even know if there's a number of the children who are arrested for some kind of sexual offense who are indeed predatory offenders. It's just the smallest, and the great harm that is caused in the meantime is. So I know this is not the place for this discussion, but I just didn't want 14 as this brilliant compromise, because 14 is so very young. Most girls, haven't developed, it's like they're starting to develop their sexuality earlier than that, but at 14, some are still not, and it's like, and we're putting an adult consequence on juveniles that it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to me in any way. So I just didn't want to leave it unsaid that 14 might be this brilliant compromise, because that doesn't do it for me. But I'm just one, and I represent no agency other than the families that I've worked with for 30 years. So yeah, I'm not, and this isn't the place for the further discussion. I get that. But you asked my question, would 16 do it? I don't know. I would have to analyze. I would think that it would take extenuating circumstances, even for a 16-year-old.
Representative O'Neill.
Thank you, Mark. So somewhere along this line, and I'm in all three of these subgroup meetings, so I don't recall which one it was, but Josh from the BCA was very articulate and explained to us the crimes that have been committed of a couple of the 40 current juveniles that are on the POR. And I'm wondering if, Josh, you would be so kind as to revisit that. And I don't know if you've all had time to dig into more of the history of those 40 juveniles that are currently on the POR, but if you could enlighten us as to some of the circumstances and some of the crimes committed of the ones that you can see. And I know that there are some that were on as juveniles and now are adults, and we've had that conversation many, many times, but if Josh would be so kind.
Yeah, as I said before, I think there's 40, we counted up to about 40 individuals who are juveniles who are currently on the registry. And it was, I would guess for all the different cases that go through the justice system, to have 40 out of 18,000, and those happen to be juveniles, what their offenses are pretty egregious. I'll try to find an example. They were, it was assaults on grandmother, assaults on the juvenile's mother, assaults on multiple children in the neighborhood, taking them into the woods. I don't think, for the most part, just not any small offense, is going to get the kids adjudicated delinquent and put on the registry. I think it's going to have to be, from what we're looking at, pretty serious offenses that have done it, not just, small offenses. So I know when Patty was saying something egregious, I'm kind of looking at what's on there, and it looks kind of like those are pretty egregious offenses that are getting the kids put on there.
Stacy.
So I didn't realize my hand was up, but I'll just say quickly, I just want to make sure that we're being clear about the data. So Josh, yeah, I think the number is 40 out of the 18,000 today are juveniles, but that doesn't account for the number of registrants who started out as juveniles. And I think that's a really important distinction. We can belittle the 40 number, but the fact of the matter is that we have more registration or more registrants who started out as juveniles and who have been on for, you know, for the 10 and certainly in the 20 years and 30 years. I'm also looking at the data that I think was sent out yesterday. And it was the summary data. And again, I'm trying to understand what the data means. So making sense of the data when we say serious, what I'm trying to find out is the number of juvenile registrants that were certified. And from the summary data, well, we had 2 of the 40 that were EJJ, and we had 2, it looks like, of the 40 or 38 that were certified. Is that everyone else's understanding? And if that's true, then those would be those serious. I'm not saying serious in terms of serious enough to be certified. Every sex crime is serious. But these are the egregious ones that, as I understand, 4 out of the 40. Am I understanding that right? If I'm not, someone please correct me.
So the BCA has not made assumptions as to what is serious and what is not.
Well, Josh just did. So
I said that it appeared that the people on the registry, the 40 juveniles on the registry, a lot of their crimes appeared to be pretty egregious.
So,
I mean,
right. So, and I'm just looking at the numbers of the 40, we've got 2 EJJs and 2 certified. So a lot, that number is, I mean, I don't know, I don't characterize as a lot. And again, I'm not belittling any sex crime, but I just want to make sure that we're being clear in understanding what the data actually says. 40 is the current number of juveniles, but that doesn't account for the number of juveniles on the registry since 1991 or whenever they started registering.
Yes.
I just want to be really clear.
Correct. So this is a moment in time picture
Today,
of purely
last week.
Right. For folks for juveniles on the registry. In pulling the summary data, there was no assumption as to what was considered serious or not. It was purely numerical, counting off the data that we had. So I don't necessarily know how those two align, but
Representative O'Neill.
Thank you. So this brings up another point that the legislature needs to hear. I just want to reiterate this, that the only data that we have available to us is just what the BCA just said. It is a moment in time. It is the 40 juveniles that are currently on the POR. It does not represent the juveniles or those that were juveniles when they went on the POR and now are adults, because that data is not available to us. Again, it would be incredibly important for the legislature to know that that data just isn't available, but we definitely could, especially again with the $7 billion surplus, order for a very intensive research study to be done of the data and rebuild the database so that we can have better information going forward, because we simply don't know if out of the 18,000 that are currently on the POR, were half of them on as juveniles and now have gone into adulthood, or 75% or 90%. We have no idea. We don't know the picture and we can't make assumptions. So in the report, I really would ask that you would articulate that and include that as a suggestion to the legislature so that we can actually have good data to make good decisions.
Sheriff Heck.
And to kind of continue with that line of thought, I think I said this before as it relates to juveniles in the registry. The issue in my mind is more a concern for those juveniles who will grow into the offenders that I'm going to be looking for in the future. And again, I've touched on the whole access piece. As a young juvenile, you'll have access to people around you. As you grow, you're going to have access to more victims. And we want to make sure this registry includes those who will grow into perhaps the predatory offender I'm going to be looking for. And I think that's the real crux of the issue.
Stacy, and we should be wrapping this up now because we're pretty much at the end, but probably with the chairs, maybe create the polling questions, maybe expand them a little bit. So Stacy.
Yeah, I guess my just last question was, is it true that we can't find out, that we can't look at current registrants of the 18,000? How many started out as juveniles, came on as juveniles?
So just the clarification on that question, I think it has been a little bit confused. That information is available. And I think what the BCA has said is that it's not easily pulled out. With the Department of Corrections, and we deal with a little over half of those registrants, we do make that determination on each person who comes into prison, whether they're based solely on a juvenile adjudication. Just the numbers from those who have come to prison for failure to register, about 20% of those 1,300 are based solely on a juvenile adjudication. So that's about 260 of those who have come to prison for a failure to register are based solely on that juvenile adjudication. So, Katie.
Thank you, Mark. So just to reiterate on Stacy's question about if the BCA can pull that information, we cannot pull that information. It's not that it's just difficult to do. The system changes and such, nothing aligns one for one. Again, we can pull any of the data that has to do with the demographic information that the statute calls out for us to hold. But when it gets into those specifics, that's where we can't drill down to say, Katie is on because of this particular offense. The systems aren't built that way. And then we have all of the system updates that once those happen, you lose the connection, if you will, to the one-to-one going back and looking at the specifics as to how someone came on the registry. So we just haven't had the systems in place all of these years. When we built it in 1990 or started in 1991, we're on about our third or fourth system right now. And it's just not easy to extract that. Or I shouldn't even say easy. We can't extract that right now. So again, as I think Representative O'Neill has said a few different times, if this is the ask, then it's probably best to go back and ask for something to be built to record that, because we again have been slated with the task of making the information available to law enforcement to track these offenders and locate them, not to identify, if they committed a juvenile or adult offense.
Well,
and I also wanted to point out too, on that juvenile data, the certification, the note that's behind those two that showed that certification, part of the plea agreement was that they did not become certified. And so there's no there's the two EJJ cases, but the certification was part of the plea.
So I think if I just wanted to clarify Stacy's question and Katie's response there. So Katie, if you look at each individual person, and not able to find out if their registration based on adjudication, if you have the time and the staff to look at each individual case, you would not be able to find out if it's juvenile?
Of the 40 I looked at, can I look at 18,000 records? No. Sorry. I can't go back in and look at 18,000. If what I did with the 40 that we had, I went in and I could look, and that's how I can say that 2 of them they attempted to certify, but I cannot go back through. Yes, we could go through court documents in the files to figure out if they were certified as, or excuse me, if they were an original adult registrant. But again, that would be going over all of those files. Is that what you're reiterating, Mark?
No, the question is, if you look at somebody's case, are you not able to tell when they started their registration and what their birth date is?
Sure.
I'm not saying that you physically could do that, but could a staff of people be able to look at each case?
So Mark, as you know, when people go in and get restarted, you know this, you see the data too. Okay, you use our system. When someone gets restarted, that initiation date changes. So it might not look like they started registering when they were 17. It might look like they started registering again when, at 28, when they served time for a domestic assault or something.
But you don't remove the earlier registration.
You can't tie it back to the register. You can't tie it. They're individual instances. What you see put together is different than going into a database and looking at data.
Yeah, we're sort of wrapping up here, but we'll move into the next session. Karen.
Well, I was just going to point out that, of course, the court data is an undercount because we started in 2011. But if you look at the first chart on the first page, I don't think there's any reason to assume that all of those juveniles, weren't required to register, because those were the cases where there was an adjudication for a registrable offense, not the same set of circumstances chart, which is below. And for EJJ, it was 220, and for juvenile, it was 525 over that 10-year period.
So essentially you have those numbers, right, Karen?
Right. I'm saying, there's some inferences there, but at least it's not that you only know about the 40. There is, there are some more conclusions that can be drawn from the court's adjudication data.
Stacy.
I'm going to take my hand down.
Okay. And Katrina, as we finish up this session.
We'll be quick, I promise, Mark. I was going to point to exactly what Karen just pointed to, but I did have a question, Katie, in regards to the 2 youth you looked at who, through a plea deal, they were not certified. Are those the 2 youth that resulted in EJJ, or was it 2 separate youth?
That I don't know offhand, Katrina, if that was part of those 2, because it was just, again, now I've looked at this a while ago, so I'm not sure if those were the 2, or if they were part of the other juveniles and later on, the EJJ program. I'm not sure.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah, and I liked Karen's data from the courts. Actually, I thought that was a pretty good, clear picture of what she just offered. And suggested. I think that the group is probably best to use that information from Karen.
Angie.
Well, I know we're over, but so Karen, looking at that chart that on your first page, so would the inference being, and I guess Katie, maybe this question's for you too. So at the bottom of each column, there's number, they seem to range generally 700s within 800s. So each year about that many juveniles, to the extent these aren't double counting, would be required to register. Is that fair?
Karen. Okay, Karen? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm trying to answer. I couldn't unmute. So I think where you're looking, are you looking in the lower blue? The 856, 818. So that's defendants and juveniles. You have to almost look to the right to the grand total column, because what we did was we compared number of cases to number of discrete party records. And remember, we could possibly miss by failing to party match, but this does seem to be 6,523 defendants over that time period, 220 EJJ juveniles, 525 non-EJJ juveniles.
Okay, so, then again, sorry, that's my bad. I was misreading that. So then breaking it down by year, then it looks like it's about 80, I don't know, 40 to 80, depending on the year.
Around 100 if you add the juveniles from both categories.
Okay, and then do those, cases, okay, so, and then in that case, are some of those the same juvenile? I thought there was something where you weren't able to sort out. So for example, if they were convicted of an adjudicated for a juvenile offense 3 of these years, the same juvenile, would they show up 3 times or 1 time?
So cases is the top line. That's the number of times. Juveniles should just be counting the people.
Okay.
So like to the right, 226 EJJ cases, 220 juveniles. 560 juvenile cases, 525 juveniles. But that assumes that the party match was made in Minces. So again, it might not be 100% accurate, but based on our party records, that's the difference. So there are some repeat offenders. And Ellen actually made a tab of repeat offenders. You really have to keep scrolling. There's a lot more tabs down on the right, and now I can't find it. Right, I think it's maybe the second tab, sorry.
Okay.
Which is kind of an interesting snapshot. It just shows the filter that 6,600 1 case, 449 2 cases, 56 people had 2 cases, 15 people had 4. Just in terms of looking at, I think there's always those questions: are there repeat offenders represented? Again, can't promise perfect party matching, but that's sort of the funnel that she was able to create.
Okay, so then the grand total numbers would give us an idea again, it's not perfect, but with respect to the 40,000 in the registry, the grand total numbers would give an idea about how many are juveniles, or some information on how many are juveniles, right?
Right. And if I was doing this, fiscal note style, I might average all these years and say an average of this many are added per year based on data we were able to, take from these 10 years, because we just can't go back any further.
Yep. Okay. Well, thank you.
Hey, can I
part data?
Sorry,
awesome.
Angie.
That's okay.
Can I just add one thing? I'm looking on the last page, and it has EJJ and initial disposition statuses, and it goes through continued for dismissal, diversion, continue without adjudication. And the juvenile non-EJJ, it has those numbers too. And it looks like there's a significant amount of the juveniles who are continued or continue without adjudication. So I think that would account for a lot of why our numbers are low of the kids on the registry, because a lot of them aren't looking like they're going to have to register because their cases were continued.
Right. And that was trying to answer that question that had come up at a couple meetings is, what is the extent to which those dispositions are offered? We collapsed a few into sort of buckets to give that picture, but we also gave you the county and district breakdown, I think, at the bottom, so that you can see if it is being used around the state. I think there were some anecdotal concerns or questions about whether that's disparate around the state. So for what it's worth, those are the numbers.
So can we move this discussion to next week, possibly, if you want to expand on that, just so we make sure that we get the methods area covered. Representative O'Neill, did you have anything before we switch?
Just really briefly. So if I recall correctly, because I'm not seeing the screen and I don't have it up. If I remember correctly, there was a distinct drop after the stay of adjudication was extended from 6 months to 12 months. If we looked at this information before, Karen, is that accurate that there was a significant drop in the numbers after that change was made at the legislature?
Right, I think that was my guess as to what had happened around that time, and I went and looked it up, and it was, I think, that very year. So you're probably right that explains maybe why, you know, there's 86 in 2011, but 30 in 2018.
My point, thank you, my point exactly. And so I think what's really important to understand is not to take the whole 10 years worth and combine them together, because something very substantial happened in the midstream of that 10 years, which is a legislative change. And again, I would pitch something about either extending stay of adjudication 18 months, 24 months, whatever we want to do for the purpose of finishing sex offender treatment. Because you can see in the data, it did make a difference when we went from 6 months to a year. So that was my only point. And I know that Representative Mueller also asked, when we talk about these things, if we could share screen so we're all literally on the same page. So since we're moving on to the next topic, I would leave it at that.
Let's do it so we can make sure we get everything covered today, but this can continue. Let's just take 2 minutes to switch over to the next session. If Kendra, you can end this recording.